Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us. Bill Goldstein is the founding editor of the books site of the New York Times on the web. He received a PhD in English from City University of New York Graduate Center. His book, The World Broke Into, Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, E.M. Forster, and the Year That Changed Literature, was published in 2017. He is working on a biography of Larry Kramer to be published by Crown. His work on the book has been supported by fellowships at the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library and the Church in Sag Harbor. And he has been awarded a 2022-23 fellowship at the Beinecke Library here at Yale to continue his research in Kramer's papers here. Edmund White's place in American letters is quite nearly inestimable. A master prose stylist and clear communicator in his writing, White has given the world 15 books of fiction, 9 works of nonfiction, including the Pulitzer Prize nominated biography of Jean Genet, and a quintet of memoirs, every one more scintillating than his predecessor. But before I go on any further with my praise, I'll defer to Bill to lead the conversation.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Michael, for inviting us to do this, and thank you, Ed, for being here.
Thank you, Billy.
I am thrilled to once again interview you. It seems we'll get to our past interviews a little while. I have to tease everyone about what we're going to talk about later. But the first thing I want to talk about with Ed is his new book, A Previous Life, which I think is one of his great novels ever, a masterpiece. And after we talk about that for a little while, since we are at the Beinecke, which is home to your papers, we are going to show some highlights from Edmund White's papers here at the Beinecke, including the holograph and various typescripts of A Boy's Own Story. And there are some other surprises to come. So let's talk about your new novel, A Previous Life. To me, really, as I said, it's a masterpiece and one of your best books ever. I just was amazed at the structural, the imaginative structure of it, and also what you are doing in it. So tell us who the Edmund White is in this book, because it's not necessarily the Edmund White exactly of today, and who Constance and Ruggiero are, and how you set this novel and framed it. It's set in the future, but covers much of the present somehow.
And it's not very futuristic. I mean, there are no strange robots running around, but because I think that's sort of tacky. But Ruggiero is a kind of Italian, Sicilian aristocrat, and who's also a musician, plays the harpsichord, and he falls in love with men and women, and is married twice, once to a German aristocrat and once to an American commoner named Constance. And at the beginning of the novel, Constance and Ruggiero are staying in a skiing lodge, and Ruggiero's broken his leg, and they've always been extremely discreet with each other, because they found that transparency in their earlier marriages was disastrous. But now they feel they're close enough to be able to be confidential. And so they decide to each write their memoir for an audience of one, the other person, and then to destroy it. And once they read it, in fact, their first instinct was the right one. It does ruin their marriage. But anyway, so Ruggiero recounts his various marriages, and including one affair with a boy who becomes a priest. And Constance recounts the stories of her two previous horrible marriages. And anyway, and then finally, after 2/3 of the book, we find out that Constance leaves him and for another man, but once she's in Akron or wherever it is, she's a little bored, so she decides to write Edmund White's memoir, and because she never knew him, but she knows that her ex-husband was married to him. So she finds all these emails and all this material, and she realizes that they had a wonderful affair that ended disastrously. And so I recount all that. And the Edmund White character is well, a minor writer of the 20th century who's been forgotten, and somebody who has been writing a biography of White says, "Oh, I'd only chosen the great David Sedaris. It'd be so much more worthwhile." And anyway, I have fun with all that, and my descriptions of Edmund White, even my worst enemy could never come up with anything worse than what I come up with, because I won't like to preempt criticism. Anyway, so he's a fat pig and very unattractive and kind of overweening. And so anyway, I have fun describing him. And that's the basic.
I love that the book starts out, as you say, they're reading an edition of one, one for each other, and then they're to be burned after a single reading. And of course, we're reading it. So immediately the games begin. And but it's a very profound book, I mean, about what love means and what love consists of, and how love either lasts or doesn't, often shading into friendship and some other kind of connection. Or you say how relentless you are on yourself. I mean, to preempt the worst criticism, but it's such an unsparing view, not only of what we can all laugh that later on you're remembered as a rather minor writer in some way, which of course, at least the Beinecke, here we are, will prevent that from happening since they've preserved everything. But the way in which, in a very serious way, you take on in the conceit that you've just described, the real emotion and the emotional devastation that this character, this Edmund White, in the novel feels. And I'm curious if you could say something about how real life informs this without it actually being necessarily literally the way everything happened, or is it?
Well, I mean, all those earlier affairs of Ruggiero and even the invention of Constance, all that's my doing. But I did have an affair with a Sicilian aristocrat who is a musician, but also gainfully employed otherwise. And he did fall in love with me through my writing. He did move to New York to be with me. We were together 3 years, and then he left me because I was too old. So a lot of the book is about age and the regretting. I can't remember, but one of Colette's characters in The Pure and the Impure says to her friends, "Oh, I was very careless. I let myself grow old," and I felt that in a way that I had let myself grow old, and I guess he was the love of my life, and our lives did intersect much like that. And I used his emails verbatim because I got his permission to do that.
Which is a very interesting bibliographic point. I mean, that I think you were saying that in America, the rules of doing that were different than
in England, yeah.
Your British publisher.
Yeah, I mean, the same publisher in America and England, Bloomsbury, brought it on. But in America, there's fair use, which means that, I don't know, but anyway, that you can use it without much of a fuss. But in England, I think the libel laws are a lot more severe. so anyway, I had to get his permission and to reprint them. But I said, I can rewrite all these, but they'll lose all their charm.
Such charm as they have, since some of them are cruel, although really they're beautiful, moving documents of love too. I mean, you make the point in what you've said, that this married couple confesses to one another, and they're in many ways confessions, and yet they're confessions that come with the caution that confession is not necessarily, might be good for the soul, but it's not good for love or marriage. I mean, so that's.
Well, I think also in couples where one is European and the other one's American, that Americans love honesty and Europeans love discretion, and they don't really go together.
And every person in the novel has a very different idea of what true love is. And if you could say something about the ways in which your own ideas of love have changed over your life. I mean, when you were a younger man in New York in the 60s, on the eve of Stonewall, and in the 70s, and what you look back on 50 years later, and what you thought then and what you think now.
I think I was thinking about this the other day, that when I was 25, 35, I would love going to parties because I always thought I'd meet the love of my life. But then at 82, I'm a little skeptical. And so you kind of have less zest for social events. But I think, I don't think I was ever happily in love. It's always been painful for me. And I think that might be one reason for that might be that I was, I became gay and came out in the 50s, which was a terrible period of oppression for gay people, but for lots of people who were strange in any way.
And so some of those early lessons, despite liberation, stick with you.
And despite 20 years on the couch.
Well, you could, I mean, we could put these two together. We could begin again. I was thinking when you were saying about the zest for going to parties at 82, I mean, I thought you were going to go in a different direction and say, well, I still have that idea of finding the love of my life because it won't have to last as long.
Very good point.
One of the things I love that you told me just as we were coming up here, which I hadn't known, is it adds to the meta of this book, which is about you, but written in about 2050, remembering you, is that this book is about to be published in Italian translation. So I love that it's about your love affair with an Italian aristocrat, and soon the book written in English will be translated into his native language.
Yes, and he very kindly translated a number of my stories that were published in Italy, and but not this book. And but what pleases me is I think that his parents, who are very literary, his father's a doctor, his mother's a philosopher, that they'll read the reviews and maybe possibly even the book. And I intend to say in interviews for Corriere della Sera, I think maybe they both died in a car accident because I never hear from them.
I do love I shouldn't say I love the image of the car crash, but one of the beautiful things you say in the book, I mean, is about this idea of true love. And I think it's Constance who thinks this, because her parents died in a car crash. I mean, that the fantasy of true love is always, is never fulfilled unless two people die in a car accident at the same time. And otherwise, love might die before both of the lovers.
Yeah, exactly.
It's so interesting to me what you were saying about you as a younger person, and the idea of finding the love of your life, or the recognition at a certain point that you won't, is I remember something that you said to me when we were talking a couple of years ago now about Larry Kramer. I interviewed you for.
Good
book.
biography you're writing, and we're all eagerly waiting to read.
Well, keep waiting. I appreciate that.
I mean, I wrote a biography now, and I say to everybody, it takes 7 years to write a biography.
I know that. Well, I think I'm going to transcribe this and send it to my editor.
Okay.
That Ed White has promised a blurb as long as I take 7 years
Yeah.
on the book. But you said something very interesting to me, and you said this, because you and Larry had your differences,
Yes.
I mean, which you were not shy about discussing, nor have you been shy over the years about discussing, nor has Larry been shy, I think, or was he? He wasn't shy about discussing. But you said something that relates to this, and you said to me that the thing to remember about people like Larry and you, who were raised on all of those Hollywood movies, is that we have a very romantic idea of love. And I honestly remember that from that conversation. And it really shaped how I thought about a lot of things, because you and Larry couldn't have taken that idea and acted upon it in your lives more differently, nor could you have dealt with that idea or worked that idea out in your fiction any differently than the two of you did. And when I read Andrew Holleran's new book, which is just being published, The Kingdom of Sand, one of the things that he and this older friend of his do, Earl, is that they watch a lot of old Hollywood movies. Earl has a huge collection of movies on DVD, and at one point, the narrator, whose name we never learned, says something like, "Oh, well, we were two old queens in love with Irene Dunn," and they're watching All About Eve, Sunset Boulevard, screwball comedies, and I thought, well, Andrew Holleran too is saying the same thing about. I don't think it's only gay men who felt this. And he too lived his own life completely differently from how you and Larry lived yours. And he does a completely different thing in his fiction. Can you say something about how movies and music shaped your lives in that way, or misshaped your lives in what you expected?
Well, I guess pop music probably meant more to most gay people than it did to me. I was always a classical music person, but
Not a dancing person.
No.
Disco.
well, I did dance at disco, but I didn't pay attention. But anyway, but as far as the movies, yes, I think that very swoony romantic vision of the young lovers meeting and waltzing and splitting up and then reuniting, whatever. I mean, that definitely influenced me. And those beautiful movies in color and with the swooning sound and all that was such a vision of love. Of course, derived probably from romantic novels of the 19th century, but in a more palatable form, I think, because those novels are kind of trashy, and a good reader sees they're trashy right away. Whereas the movies are a much more persuasive medium, I think. I mean, I think a book is a rather rebarbative medium. You have to get 20 pages in before you can begin to stand it. And
Not in a previous life.
no, of course not. But anyway, I think that but that vision of love that certainly came in so many movies, it is one that kind of was bred into our bones, and it's what we sort of expected out of life. And of course, as you say, Larry and Eric and I have 3 different responses to it. I think Andrew Holleran and Eric Garber has sort of retreated into severe solitude. And Larry did get married to the love of his life finally. And so it all turned out well. And I carried a torch for somebody all my life and but never really quite planted my torch anyplace.
As it were. But that's part of the romance, I think, when you read The Beautiful Room is Empty. I mean, when you read The Farewell Symphony, I mean, other books, I mean, you feel this great love. I don't know if it's percolating beneath or suffusing everything, even when the protagonist, the narrator, is foiled. I can't think of the right word. Disappointed, saddened. I mean, amid death. I mean, amid psychological difficulties. I mean, there's this kind of hope, and that's true. It seems to me in the previous life. So it was very interesting when you were saying about going to parties or being 82 and perhaps not thinking about the love of your life or looking for the love of your life. Now, it seems that has not, being 82 has not dimmed in any way the creativity that you're not just repeating yourself in your books or your memoirs. And that's why the structure of previous life is so thrilling to me. I mean, is that you're still really moving pieces around in an inventive way. And do you feel that there's any link between your continued, I don't want to say youthful creativity as if people aren't creative in old age, but this regenerative creativity that keeps coming? That is there more fuel for that if you've now given up looking for the love of your life?
I don't think I exactly have given it up. but I do think it keeps me engaged. And I mean, my husband is also a reason that I stay happy, because he's always organizing social events and bringing people by and keeping me stimulated mentally. And so I think that's part of it. But but I really enjoy writing too. I mean, I enjoy having written. I don't really enjoy writing, but and I do feel like the two parts of creativity are invention and imitation. And imitation has always intrigued me, of trying to get a likeness of the people I've known or even aspects of my own personality. But invention is something that came to me a little later, this desire to create plots and structures that will be a kind of an objective correlative to what I'm talking about.
Well, you mentioned, we've been talking one about previous life, and you haven't given up necessarily on looking for the love of your life. And you mentioned your husband. We're going to bring Michael Carroll into the conversation in a little bit. That's one of the things that I was teasing about. But I wanted to go, since we are at the Beinecke, to some highlights of your previous life. And you say that you enjoy having written. So we are going to show some of the things that the Beinecke has that you have written, including, I'm going to, this is Tim Young again, thank you. This is the first holograph of A Boy's Own Story, the earliest version of A Boy's Own Story. And I think everyone can see, I mean, one, it's all handwritten, obviously, the holograph. And what's wonderful to me about the opening, if we go back, is that the first line, we're going for a midnight boat ride, survives in every iteration, including what we're going to be talking about, the graphic novel version of it, which is being published in the fall, and that's what Michael Carroll is going to come and discuss with us. But can you tell me a little bit about at least what your writing process was then? Because when we brought this out, you went, I mean, obviously you hadn't seen it in a long time.
And I too was surprised that the opening line remained the same, because you think that it's gone through so many rewrites and editing and stuff, but that I must have had a clear idea of what I was going to write about. I showed this, I read this first chapter to the great composer Virgil Thompson, who was staying with us, my Chris Cox, my past boyfriend, and he was staying with us in Key West. And I think he was somebody who thought of being much older than us and being gay. I think he thought of gay writing as being erotic only. And so I think I typed this up, so I gave it to him. He read it in his room, and then he came out and he said, well, as we say in Mississippi, there's a lot of wash here, but not much hangout. Meaning that it didn't get him too excited. But and
He should only be able to read a previous life.
yeah, really, yeah. But I've always sort of maintained the frankly erotic note in almost all my writing, which I enjoy doing because I think that's lifelike. I mean, Freud said we think about sex 90% of the time. And it seems like it's only about 5% of the time in books usually.
And was that something that you consciously did? I mean, he might have criticized that there's not a lot of hangout, but did you think of this as a more erotic book than he did? I mean, there's certainly sexual tension in it.
No, I thought it should have erotic elements, but I also thought that I want to write a literary book because I mean, I was a great admirer of Christopher Isherwood and especially A Single Man. And I felt that was groundbreaking because it was so psychologically accurate and such a wonderfully compressed and beautifully written story. And I thought, but so much gay writing was kind of trashy. And I thought, I do want to write something literary.
So you not Gordon Merritt, the Lord Won't Mind.
That's right.
Like that.
And the other thing that happened was, you know, like 10 years after Stonewall, a lot of gay books came out, like Larry Kramer's Faggots, like Tales of the City, like Andrew Holland's book Dance from the Dad, my own book Nocturnes for the King of Naples, but I think the thing that had changed is that whereas earlier gay writers, like let's say Gore Vidal, had thought they had to explain gay life because their reader was a straight reader, whereas we felt like our reader is already initiated and we're writing for other gay people. So we don't have to say where Fire Island is or what its rituals are.
So there was the difference of time. You weren't making a case for the sort of.
That's right. It wasn't a plea for understanding or an introduction to the strange exotic world of homosexuality.
It was just presenting the psychological and emotional and
Particular
sexual
character,
reality.
yeah.
I mean, you can see, I mean, how much, obviously, the draft was a draft and you were working on it. I love that one of the things we saw here, so there's a lot of writing, and then you came to some other moments where you were, I guess, trying to figure out, where you were going to go next. I mean, tell us about these cats.
Well, Chris Cox had a cat, and he was always roaming around. And Chris had a bedroom, and I had a bedroom. We had a very beautiful house in Key West that was quite large, and the cat would come to visit me, and I would rather draw it than write.
So this is the holograph. I mean, and obviously it's wonderful to see all the changes that go through, like on a page with a lot of crossings out, obviously. But you said you thought you typed it up for Virgil Thompson. You certainly typed it up for your editor, and I wanted to show the next version of it that is here at the Beinecke. There are typescripts and then there are proofs. And one of the magical things is that the typescript and then the proofs have changes that were put in by Bill Whitehead. So if you could tell us a little bit about who Bill Whitehead was and where Boy's Own Story came in your career. I mean, we talked about, you said Nocturnes for the King of Naples, you had published, you had also published Forgetting Elena.
I think Troy
Okay,
Chase back.
yes, yeah.
But anyway, then this came along, and I had sort of, because of my two first novels, I've been considered a kind of avant-garde writer, or at least experimental. But with Boy's Own Story, I thought gay life is already so strange, and particularly at that point in history, that I don't want to confuse people by having a complicated style. I want it to be as limpid as possible. But it's true that I had a wonderful editor, Bill Whitehead, who passed away because of AIDS early on in the game, but who was a great editor and a great friend and a great inspiration.
So we now see Maxine Grofsky Literary Agency, 2 Fifth Avenue. She lives in the same building that Larry Kramer lived in.
Still lives there.
And W. Whitehead, he did these corrections either February to March of 1982 or on February 3rd, 1982. But I think probably he took a little while. And what's wonderful is you said that you were seeking sort of the limpid style. And what I think it's often possible to forget is that the limpid, simple, straightforward style takes a lot of editing. It's not necessarily achieved in the first round. So we saw the holograph, and then even as it's reaching its final stage, there are notes from Bill Whitehead in the margin. And then this page, longer remarks where you exchange comments back and forth. It's sort of like what would be done electronically now, but he sent it to you and then you must have sent it back. And then the way in which the antediluvian ways in which a manuscript was actually produced for the press. But I just think the way in which changes go through so many steps. And Bill Whitehead, as you said, he died of AIDS early on, but he was an important person in bringing gay writing to the level that you're talking about, where it didn't need introductions or frames.
Yeah, no. Michael Denny had been also, for me, an important editor. He had edited Nocturnes for the King of Naples, and he was an editor who was willing to take a chance on gay stuff. He was himself gay, as was Bill. But I would meet gay editors later in the 80s, and I would say, I really enjoyed your book, A Beautiful Room is Empty. And I said, well, how come you didn't take it? And he said, I couldn't have, because I would have lost my job because people would have known I was gay.
I mean, it's interesting to me. I mean, that didn't change. I mean, for quite a while after that. And one of the things that was always interesting to me as a person who wrote about publishing and was gay, college on, and because I was a journalist, perhaps didn't have to be in the closet, is that one of the things in publishing, and I think in other industries, was that there were gay editors and things like that, although they had to live within limits. You know, publishing a gay book was a special interest. You could only do so many every so often. I think people made that calculation. But there were a lot of very successful gay literary agents in the 80s, because it was a way of being outside the publishing corporate hierarchy and yet be able to make a name for yourself. Adjacent to it. And you didn't have to worry about the CEO, or you didn't have to worry about that kind of social engagement with the chairman of the board's wife or something like that. And so a lot of
mentioning your own career, the very first thing I think you ever wrote when you worked for Publishers Weekly was an interview of me that is down there.
Well, thank you. This relates to A Boy's Own Story.
Yes.
So here we are seeing A Boy's Own Story in its various iterations before it was published. And then when it was published, I was an editor at Publishers Weekly. I had just gone to work at Publishers Weekly when I graduated college in June of 1982. And the next month, I interviewed you in advance of the publication of A Boy's Own Story. And it was the first author interview I ever did. And this is
done thousands.
and thousands of you at least. And then, so this was published in Publishers Weekly in September of 1982. And as I say, it was the first author interview I ever wrote. And I love the opening line. Edmund White is perhaps one of the most candid gay writers in America today. And I reread the interview. You were very kind to have it selected for this book, Conversations with Edmund White, that the University of Mississippi Press published a few years ago. And the only word that I really wanted to change was when we're talking about the two-word label gay writer, it aptly sums up White's status. But I used the word sobriquet, which I so wish after Grey Gardens and Edie Beale referring to, her sobriquet, Body Beautiful Beale. I so wish that I had not used it as a naive 22-year-old who had not yet seen Grey Gardens, either the movie or the musical. So that's the one change I would make 40 years on now that we are looking at it. But so it was really the start to my career, was interviewing you.
Well, it was like some of the first acknowledgement I'd ever had. So it was very important for me too.
It was sort of amazing to me to look back on it and realize that, partly because of what you were talking about had happened in the 70s. I mean, that by 1982, when I graduated college, I didn't need to really come out officially. I mean, I was able at the magazine to be gay without making a statement of it. And the first author I suggested I interviewed was the gay author, Edmund White. And I don't think I realized what privilege that was, or how much that had built on what had come before. I just think I was naive about it.
You didn't seem naive to me.
I remember that I met you in your office at NYU at the Center for the Humanities.
Mhm.
And during the conversation, it started to rain. And afterwards, you had an umbrella, and you lived further in the East Village, and I was going to visit my boyfriend who lived on 5th Street and 1st Avenue. And so you walked me at least part of the way under your umbrella. Very kind of
I should have walked you the whole way.
you.
Thank God.
So this is A Boy's Own Story as it was. And now I want to talk about, in the time we have left, to bring in Michael Carroll to talk about the graphic novel, A Boy's Own Story, the novel version, the graphic novel version that is to be. And this is going to be published in the fall. November, is that what you said? So Michael Carroll, thank you for joining us. He is the co-adapter of this graphic novel version of A Boy's Own Story. So I just love that we are talking about what's at the Beinecke, and how everything that's at the Beinecke actually is not just an archive, but it's the basis for new creative work, both from Ed and from you. So if you could talk about what we're seeing here. I mean, this is obviously the cover of it. And how you reconceived the book, the novel, in order to be a graphic novel. I mean, this is one of the opening images of the main character.
Yes, I'll try to be as succinct as possible. First of all, I don't remember how it all came together. There's so many collaborators. My text collaborator, we are co-adapters, is Brian Alessandro. The illustrator is a man named Igor Karash, who is based in St. Louis and has done many graphic novels, but this is his first in the States, I think. This is the opening that we stayed true to the novel. We retained every scene that is in the original novel. And then we added flash forwards and framing devices to describe the arc of Ed's life. We call the character Eddie Valentine. Valentine is Ed's real middle name. We're going for a midnight boat ride. You can see that right there.
So that from the holograph to the hologram.
Yeah, right. We insisted that yeah, see, we're going for a minute. We insisted that we retain that first line because it's so evocative. It's strange because it's in the present tense. So, but then it becomes quickly historical. And we did things, we took so many liberties, but we tried to retain every scene. Now here's an example of a scene on the top two panels taking place in Fountain Square Park in Cincinnati, which is where some of the action in the novel takes place. And then a kind of weird companion thing is a flash forward into the AIDS era, where people are next to a fountain.
If you can see, because this is one of the interjections. I mean, if you could say, how in the reconception, I call it an interjection, but that's not quite right.
So that's Ed in his smoking booth. We put him in the scene. He's observing. He's remembering while observing the present. And then there's his boy self on the other end of the bench.
And also, so you can see in the foreground of that drawing, I mean, someone in a wheelchair, I mean, perhaps a person ill with AIDS. I mean, it says once before the plague, it had almost been as easy as pointing and choosing. And one of the things that is remarkable to me about that is that you did reconceive it to not have only a frame, but to have a new texture throughout. But when Ed and I met in 1982, so this would have been July, perhaps 1982. Ed, you had been one of the co-founders of GMHC in January of 1982. So obviously by 1982, we're a year.
Gay men's health crisis.
Gay men's health crisis, yes. We're a year, by July of 1982, we're a year into the epidemic. And I had heard of AIDS even when I was in college, but don't think I really knew very much about what was going on. And one of the things that I don't think you and I discussed AIDS in July of 1982, but in the next spring, I interviewed Andrew Holleran for Publishers Weekly about his novel then, Nights in Aruba, and we talked about AIDS a lot by that point, and even it is remarked on, it's talked about in the interview. So I've always pointed my own sort of awareness of the AIDS crisis sometime between interviewing Edmund White and sometime between you and Andrew Holleran. So that's the way in which AIDS is brought into the novel, even though AIDS was after the novel. And now there's also time in Ed's life that is brought in.
Flash forward beyond the initial AIDS era to the point at which Ed moves to Paris, having published A Boy's Own Story and really begun his career as a literary celebrity. And unfortunately, there's a great deal of nudity in the book, a great deal. But I meant fortunately. Yeah. There is a lot, it's so much of it is implied in the writing, but of course it's not necessarily described, but this is a graphic novel. So, and I wanted to say the flash forwards and a lot of the psychological fantasias were actually the idea of my co-adapter, Brian Alessandro. And then Igor brought all of the illustrative chops. And I think it's his first color one in America. The whole thing is full color. And I think that's all I have to say.
I mean, what was wonderful to me about reading this, I mean, as someone who read A Boy's Own Story and reread A Boy's Own Story, is to me, it felt like watching an operatic, its adaptation as an opera. I mean, something new was brought to it, not music per se, but that it was reconceived as if for the stage to make it relevant and what was to the moment now in which it's being published. So it's not an artifact. I mean, it's not something that treats 1982 as something unassailable, or the book as something
like a classic comic.
Yes, exactly. So so that was really wonderful. So congratulations on that.
We're very happy and excited.
So that's November, and I think you will be airlifting copies into Florida and dropping them in schoolyards.
All over the Southeast, we'll be sending them to high school public libraries.
So should we start a GoFundMe for that right here and now?
Yeah. I mean, we would hate for it to be banned right around the election. That would be terrible.
Sorry to interrupt, but the building will be closing in just one moment, but a couple of last words or observations or
Oh.
advice for young writers.
Ed, do you have advice for young writers?
Advice for young writers. Well, I guess in my case, it was just blind persistence that finally got me published. I mean, I was 32 by the time I got something published, and but I had already written 5 novels, but I think one of which is here in the Beinecke. No, the first version of the beautiful Woman.
Yes, yeah.
Is here.
Oh, here, and also another novel called Woman Reading Pascal, or and both are unpublished.
So blind persistence.
If you think that you might need to write a fan letter to your Leary Eye, maybe you should.
That's how Michael, you're a published writer in your own right. I mean,
Yeah, I publish
so-
other books.
other books, including Stella Maris, which is a wonderful book, and yet perhaps the most consequential piece of writing was the fan letter to Edmund White.
Probably. I don't know, it might be here. I don't know.
The character of Ruggiero in a previous life also did something similar. It didn't work out quite the same way for him. For the different fates on display here at the Beinecke Library.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us, and thanks to my wonderful guests, Michael, Bill, and Ed, for joining us. Sorry we didn't have time for questions, but you can always write fan letters. Join us again. Thank you.